The blood hit the floor before the gurney did. A man, mid-40s, construction vest shredded, 3 fingers on his left hand barely attached, came through the ER doors at Callaway Memorial Hospital at 4:47 in the morning, screaming in a way that made the intake clerk knock over her coffee. The trauma team scrambled, monitors screeched, someone called for a crash cart before they even knew if they needed one. And in the middle of all that noise, Madison Reed was already moving. She was 31 years old, 5'6", with dark circles under her eyes, from a double shift she hadn't agreed to take, and hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She was not the attending physician, she was not the charge nurse. She was the night shift nurse that the senior staff called on when they needed someone to do the work they didn't want to do, and then ignored when it was time to take credit for it. She saw the arterial bleed before Dr. Harlan Voss finished reading the intake form. "He's going to arrest in about 90 seconds if we don't—" "I have eyes, Reed." Voss didn't look up. "Get me a second line started and stay out of the way." She started the line. She stayed in the way. Because she was right, and she knew it, and 90 seconds later the patient's pressure dropped to 60 over nothing, and Voss finally looked at what she'd already been looking at for the past 2 minutes. A jetting bleed from a partially severed radial artery that was going to empty this man out onto the floor of Bay 3 if someone didn't pack it and hold it right now. Madison had her hands on it before anyone gave the order. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when something happens that shouldn't have been possible. Voss stared. The 2 residents stared. The scrub tech in the corner stared. The patient stabilized. Voss cleared his throat, adjusted his stethoscope, said, without looking at her, "Good catch." Not good save. Not you were right. Not even her name. Good catch. Like she'd spotted a dropped pen. She didn't say anything. She stepped back, stripped her gloves, and went to wash her hands. Her shift still had 4 hours left, and there were 2 more patients waiting. If you've made it this far, do me a favor. Follow this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Callaway Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Denton Falls, a mid-sized city in the kind of region where the winters lasted too long, and the hospital was both the largest employer and the most complained about institution in the county. It had 3 floors, a level 2 trauma designation, and a staff that had sorted itself over years of institutional drift into a hierarchy so rigid it might as well have been printed in the employee handbook. At the top, the attending physicians who made the decisions took the credit and ate lunch in the second-floor lounge that the nursing staff had been quietly disinvited from about 6 years ago. Below them, the charge nurses, administrators, and supervisors who enforced the hierarchy with the particular enthusiasm of people who had once been at the bottom of it. And then there was everyone else. Madison Reed had worked the night shift at Callaway for 3 years. She'd come in from somewhere, no one was entirely sure where, and she didn't volunteer it, with a resume that was solid but unremarkable, skills that were obviously good but not the kind she talked about, and a personality that some people read as standoffish and others read as simply quiet. She kept to herself. She did her work. She did often other people's work too because she was reliable in reliability. And a hospital running on a skeleton night crew was a quality that got exploited as fast as it got noticed. Her direct supervisor was a man named Gerald Patton. He was 53, had been in hospital administration for 18 years, and operated with the specific confidence of someone who had never once been seriously challenged in a professional setting. He had what his assistant privately called the clipboard posture, always walking with something in hand, always 3 seconds away from writing something down about someone. Patton had made his opinion of Madison Reed clear within her first month. She was competent, he'd said to the charge nurse, Donna Willard, in the break room while Madison was 12 feet away on the other side of the supply cart. Competent, but not ambitious. The type that stays comfortable. No upward trajectory. Then he'd noticed her and nodded at her, pleasantly, like he hadn't just summarized her entire career potential while she was close enough to hear every word. Madison had looked at him for a moment. Then she'd finished counting the IV supplies and walked away. That was 3 years ago. The dynamic had calcified since then. Patton scheduled her for the shifts no one wanted. assigned her the patients who were the most complicated to document and the least likely to generate positive satisfaction scores. And whenever she flagged a clinical concern through the proper channels, her notes were acknowledged with a response time that suggested they'd been filed somewhere and forgotten. She had written 3 formal incident reports in the past year, 2 about inadequate staffing ratios on overnight, 1 about a medication protocol she believed was creating unnecessary risk for post-surgical patients in recovery. All 3 had been, according to Patton's office, under review. She knew what under review meant. It meant nothing. She had learned not to expect anything different, and she had learned not to let it show. That was the thing about Madison Reed that the people around her had fundamentally misread as passivity. The stillness wasn't surrender. It was something else, something older and considerably more disciplined. But no one at Callaway Memorial knew enough about her to understand the difference. The night Patton finally moved against her started ordinarily enough. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold that got into the building through the gaps in the sliding doors and made the night staff wear their coats until the heating system caught up around 2 a.m. Madison was the senior nurse on a floor with 11 patients and 2 nursing assistants, one of whom had called out sick and been replaced by a float pool nurse named Terry, who was cheerful, enthusiastic, and had never worked in this unit before. At 11:20 p.m., Patton arrived unannounced on the floor, clipboard in hand. This was unusual. He worked days. He did not, generally, come in at 11 at night. The fact that he was there meant something had been planned, and Madison felt that understanding land in her chest before he even opened his mouth. Read. He stopped at the nurse's station. A word. I have a patient in 114 who needs. Terry can handle it. A word. Now. They stepped into the small conference room adjacent to the station. Patton placed his clipboard on the table and looked at her with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news that they were privately enjoying. I'm going to be straightforward with you, he said. In her experience, sentences that started that way were rarely followed by anything straightforward. We've had some concerns raised about your performance, patient communication scores, documentation delays. A few of the physicians have mentioned that you can be. He paused, selecting the word carefully. Difficult to work with. Madison said nothing. She looked at him. She was very good at looking at people without giving them anything back. Patton continued. I put together a performance improvement plan. It'll be a 60-day review period during which you'll be moved to float status. No consistent assignment. We'll assess from there. Float status, which meant no consistent patient load, no continuity, no ability to advocate meaningfully for anyone. It also meant she'd be filling gaps across the hospital wherever she was needed, the most exhausting possible use of a nurse, and the one with the least professional visibility. Which physicians raised concerns, she asked. That's confidential. The documentation delays are those being compared against our staffing ratios? Because on nights when I'm running 11 patients solo, documentation speed, the PIP isn't up for debate tonight. He picked up the clipboard. HR will send you the formal paperwork tomorrow. You'll start float status at the beginning of next week. He walked out. She stood in the conference room for approximately 45 seconds, looking at nothing. Then she went back to check on the patient in 114 who needed to be repositioned and whose pain hadn't been adequately reassessed since the last shift change. She did the job. She always did the job. But something in her had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the disciplined stillness she'd maintained for 3 years. Something colder, more deliberate. She was still doing the job when the first SUV pulled into the Callaway Memorial parking lot at 4:14 a.m. She didn't see it arrive. She was in the middle of a medication pass, working through the list with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of doing the same tasks under conditions that would have broken a less focused person. Terry, the float nurse, was at the station. The ER was 3 floors down and connected by a long corridor and 2 elevator banks to the unit she was on. The radio crackdown from security came at 4:31. She heard it at the nurse's station, not the words exactly, but the change in frequency. The particular crackle of a walkie-talkie being keyed by someone who had something unusual to report. Donna Willard, the charge nurse, was on for a rare overnight coverage shift and picked up her radio with a frown. Security says there are people in the ER asking for a staff member by name, Donna said. She wasn't talking to Madison specifically, just talking, the way people do when something puzzles them. Madison finished logging her medication documentation. Who? Don't know yet. Donna keyed her radio. Security, this is charge on 3. Who are your visitors asking for? The answer came back after a short pause. A nurse named Madison Reed. 4 of them, ma'am. They're in uniform. Donna looked up. Madison had already stopped moving. Military uniform? Donna asked into the radio. Yes, ma'am. Army looks like. They've got credentials. They're being very calm, but they're not leaving. The hallway felt suddenly smaller. Madison was aware of Terry looking at her from across the station, and of the particular quality of the silence that had fallen over the floor, the way people in institutional spaces sense a disruption before they fully understand it. I'll go down, Madison said. Donna put a hand on her arm. You don't have to go anywhere. We can have security. It's fine. She said it in a way that meant the conversation was over, and something in her voice apparently made Donna step back, because the charge nurse let go and didn't follow her. Madison took the stairs. There were 4 of them in the ER waiting area, and they were not what she expected, which was strange, because she didn't know what she'd expected, only that it wasn't this. They were not young. The one in front was maybe 50, with a face that had been weathered by something other than time alone, and he wore his uniform with the ease of someone who'd been wearing it for 30 years and couldn't imagine putting on anything else. His rank was Command Sergeant Major. She registered that automatically before she registered anything else. He saw her the moment she came through the corridor doors. His face changed. Something shifted, not dramatically, but enough, like a long-held breath beginning to release. The ER around them was at a Tuesday night lull. 2 nurses at the desk. A patient in Bay 2 with what looked like a sprained ankle. The overnight attending, a young doctor named Shira Moss who had done her residency somewhere on the East Coast and was good, actually good, and wasn't part of the hierarchy that had spent 3 years treating Madison like furniture. Moss was leaning against the counter with a chart, and she looked up when Madison came in, and then looked at the 4 military personnel and quietly put the chart down. Madison stopped about 6 feet from the Command Sergeant Major. I'm Madison Reed, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not quite relief, not quite grief. Something in between. Sergeant Major Dale Rutherford, he said. I've been looking for you for 6 years. The ER was absolutely silent. Madison said nothing. Her face gave away nothing. But her hands, which had been loose at her sides, had stilled in a very specific way, and Shira Moss, who was perceptive and watching carefully, noticed that Madison Reed looked, in that moment, like a completely different person than the one who had handed off charting notes to her 4 hours ago. You're difficult to find, Rutherford said. There was no accusation in it. If anything, there was something that almost sounded like respect. I wasn't hiding, she said. I just wasn't looking to be found. One of the other 3 soldiers, a woman, late 30s, a staff sergeant by her insignia, shifted slightly at that. Not a reaction, exactly. More like someone confirming something they'd already suspected. Rutherford reached into the front pocket of his uniform and produced something small. He placed it on the counter between them. A combat medic badge. The old style, worn smooth on the edges. The kind that had been carried in a pocket for a long time. Madison looked at it. She didn't pick it up. I think you know why we're here, Rutherford said. I have a shift that ends in 2 hours, she said. I know. We'll wait. She didn't make them wait. She couldn't, once she'd seen the badge. It was too specific. It meant too much. Not as an object exactly, but as a signal. You didn't send 4 people and a CSM to a hospital in Denton Falls at 4 in the morning to make a symbolic gesture. Something had happened, or something was about to happen, and she had learned a long time ago that pretending not to see things you'd already seen was a particular kind of cowardice she didn't have the patience for. She told Donna she was taking a break. Donna looked like she had 17 questions and was smart enough not to ask any of them. She found an empty family consultation room off the main ER corridor, beige walls, 2 chairs, a box of tissues on the table that was down to its last 3, and she and Rutherford went in while his 3 soldiers waited outside. Rutherford sat across from her. He didn't have any paperwork in front of him. He'd clearly done this before, or something like it, and he'd learned that paperwork too early in a conversation like this was the wrong move. "You left without formal separation," he said. "Medical hardship request approved, but you didn't do the out processing. You just stopped." "I know what I did. I'm not criticizing it." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand that before I say anything else. What you went through, what happened in that valley. I've spent 6 years thinking about whether there was something we could have done differently for you, for the people we sent into that situation." She looked at the box of tissues. 3 left. "What happened?" she said. "Not what happened in the valley. Just what happened. Present tense, current." Rutherford leaned forward slightly. "There's a congressional oversight inquiry. It's been running for about 8 months and it's gotten serious in the last 90 days. What happened on that operation? The decisions that were made, the orders that came down, the information that was withheld from people on the ground. It's being investigated formally, and the people who were there—" He paused. "The people who were there have been identified as relevant witnesses." Madison was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't keep records," she said. "You didn't need to. Other people did." He watched her face. "And some of them have been looking for you specifically, Madison, because of what you did. Not what happened to you. What you did." She stood up, walked to the window that looked out on the parking lot, where she could see one of the black SUVs and, beyond it, the edge of the city starting to gray toward dawn. "The men who were injured," she said. "How many of them? 7 are still active duty, 3 retired, 2 went on to medical careers, actually." A pause. "All 11 are alive." She absorbed that. She had not let herself count in the years since. It had seemed dangerous somehow to count, like looking directly at something bright enough to damage you. "All 11, she said. "All 11. Outside, the parking lot lights were beginning to look faint against the early sky. She turned back around. "What do you need from me?" Rutherford reached into his pocket again. This time he produced a folded document. A summons, she registered, though she didn't reach for it yet. "Testimony, formal statement. You'd need to travel to D.C. in about 3 weeks, but before that—" He set the document on the table between them. "There's someone who specifically asked us to find you. He's been asking for about 2 years. "Who?" "His name is Corporal Travis DeLuca, or former corporal. He goes by just Travis now." Rutherford's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He says you dragged him across 40 meters of open ground while 3 different people were actively shooting at both of you. He says you told him to stop apologizing for being heavy, or you'd leave him there." She looked at the window again. "He wasn't that heavy," she said quietly. Rutherford laughed, a short, honest sound that filled the small beige room and caught her off guard. It was the laugh of someone who had been in hard places and come out the other side still capable of it. "He's going to be very glad to hear that," Rutherford said. Well, Gerald Patton arrived at Callaway Memorial at 7:15 a.m., which was slightly earlier than his usual arrival because he'd gotten a call from the overnight security supervisor about the military visitors and had decided he needed to manage the situation before it became something he couldn't manage. He found them in the main ER waiting area. 2 of the soldiers were still there, the staff sergeant and a younger specialist who had the very still quality of someone trained to be comfortable waiting indefinitely. Rutherford and the 4th soldier, Madison had quietly told her, had gone to retrieve something from their vehicle. Patton walked up to the 2 soldiers with the specific energy of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "I'm going to need to ask you both to wait outside," he said. "This is a medical facility. Unauthorized personnel." "We're authorized," the staff sergeant said. She didn't stand up. She looked at him with an expression of almost total neutrality. "By whom?" She handed him a document without a word. He took it, read it. His expression went through a sequence of changes that Shira Moss, who was watching from the nurse's desk and would later describe the moment to 3 separate colleagues, cataloged as confusion, irritation, something harder to name, and then something very close to alarm. This is... He stopped. Read it again. You're here under a congressional inquiry directive? We are. He looked up. The staff sergeant was still watching him with that expression of total neutrality, and he seemed to realize, in the way people realize things too late, that this had not been a conversation he was going to win. I'll need to contact our legal department, he said. That's your right, she said. But Sergeant Major Rutherford will want to speak with you directly before you make any calls about your facility's treatment of the individual we're here to see. Patton's face did something complicated. What about her treatment? 3 formal incident reports, the staff sergeant said. She hadn't looked at any notes. Filed over the past 13 months. All currently marked under review. A performance improvement plan initiated 48 hours ago, moving her to float status. Documentation of at least 6 instances in which her clinical assessments were dismissed or overridden by physicians who subsequently required her intervention to manage patient outcomes. The ER had gotten quieter. There were 4 or 5 staff members in earshot, and none of them were pretending not to listen. Patton said, "Those are internal personnel matters, and I am not going to discuss them with—" "You don't need to discuss them with me." The staff sergeant stood up. She was exactly his height, and she looked at him with the kind of calm that has nothing to prove. "You'll discuss them with the Congressional Inquiry Team, the hospital board, and potentially a federal mediator if this situation proceeds the way it currently appears to be proceeding." A pause. "I'd suggest contacting your legal department." He stood there for a moment, and then he walked away very quickly toward the administrative wing, and every person in that ER watched him go. Shira Moss looked at the staff sergeant. "Thank you," Moss said quietly. The staff sergeant glanced at her. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The day is young." Madison was in the locker room when her shift technically ended at 7:30 a.m. She sat on the bench for a while, not changing yet, looking at the worn linoleum floor. She had the summons document in her bag. She had Rutherford's contact card. She had the weight of a conversation that had cracked open 6 years of deliberate quiet. The door opened. It was Terry, the float nurse, still in scrubs, clearly not sure whether to come in or not. "Hey," Terry said, I wanted to say, whatever's happening, everyone on the floor thinks—" He stopped, tried again. "You've been the only one up there who's ever actually explained things to me instead of just telling me what to do. I thought you should know that." Madison looked at him. He was maybe 24, cheerful, enthusiastic, hadn't been broken by the institution yet. She hoped, briefly and with unexpected intensity, that it stayed that way. "Get some sleep, Terry," she said. He nodded and left. She sat there another minute. Outside, she could hear the hospital coming to life. The day shift arriving, the breakfast trays going out, the particular rhythm of a facility that never actually stopped. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Gerald Patton was on the phone with the hospital's legal department, and she could have predicted every word he was saying, every justification he was constructing, every framing he was building around himself. She knew how those conversations went. She had seen what happened when institutions protected themselves, but she also knew, for the first time in 3 years she knew it clearly, that this time the people on the other side of the conversation were not going to let that stand. She picked up her bag. The combat medic badge that Rutherford had placed on the ER counter was now in her jacket pocket. He told her to keep it. "It's yours," he'd said. "It's been yours for a long time." She didn't know yet exactly what the next 3 weeks were going to bring. The inquiry, the testimony, the 11 men, all of them alive, some of them apparently willing to speak. She didn't know what it was going to feel like to have the things she'd spent 6 years burying pulled back into the light. What she knew, standing up in the locker room of Callaway Memorial Hospital at 7:44 in the morning after a double shift and the strangest conversation of her adult life, was that Gerald Patton had moved against her 48 hours ago, believing she had nothing. He'd been wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. And somewhere in the parking lot, Command Sergeant Major Dale Rutherford was waiting, and he had driven through the night to find her, and he had brought with him documentation and witnesses and a congressional directive and the names of 11 people whose continued existence in the world was in some direct and unambiguous way connected to decisions she had made in a valley 6 years ago when everything was on fire and the only thing she'd refused to do was leave. She zipped her bag. She walked out. The parking lot was colder than the building, the way hospital parking lots always are. All that concrete holding the night's temperature past the point when the air itself had started to warm. Madison walked out into it with her bag on one shoulder and her jacket not quite zipped, and Rutherford was exactly where she'd expected him to be, standing beside the lead SUV with a paper coffee cup in each hand, not looking at his phone, just watching the entrance like someone who had learned that waiting was a skill the same as any other. He offered her one of the cups without preamble. She took it. It was from the vending machine inside. The bad kind. The kind that tasted like hot water had been introduced to a coffee bean at a polite distance. But it was warm, and she hadn't eaten since 11 the previous night, and she was past the point of being selective. "You drive through?" she asked. "Left at 10 last night." He looked at the building. "Your administration's been calling around. Legal department is involved, I'm told." Patton moves fast when he thinks he's defending territory. He's going to find that the ground shifted under him sometime in the last 6 hours. Rutherford said it without satisfaction. It was just a fact, stated plainly, the way he seemed to state most things. "What do you need? Before we get into any of this formally, what do you actually need right now?" She thought about it. It was a more honest question than she'd expected, and she took a second to give it an honest answer. "Sleep," she said, "and then an explanation of what specifically you need from me, in what order, and what happens on the other end of it." "That's fair." He took a sip of his coffee, made a face at the taste. "We've got a hotel on the other side of the city. Nothing dramatic. You can rest. We'll brief you at 2 this afternoon if that works. No pressure to decide anything today." "What am I deciding?" He looked at her. "Whether you want to testify voluntarily or wait for a formal subpoena. The inquiry team would prefer voluntary. It looks better for everyone, and it gives you more control over how you present. But it's your choice." "What's the subpoena timeline?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. They're moving." She looked at the sky. The gray had gone pink at the edges over the rooftops, and somewhere on the other side of the hospital, the day shift traffic would be starting to build. She'd driven this route enough times that she could map it blind. The on-ramp, the merge, the particular pothole on Miller Street that the city had been promising to fix for 8 months. 2 o'clock, she said. He nodded. No triumph in it, just confirmation. She drove herself. He didn't suggest she do otherwise, which she appreciated. The assumption of autonomy, small as it was, meant something after 3 years in a place that had treated her independent judgment as a liability. She followed the convoy at a distance, 2 SUVs ahead of her and 2 behind, which felt excessive, and probably was, but which she suspected was less about security and more about Rutherford's particular style of doing things thoroughly. She slept 4 hours. No dreams, or none she remembered. The briefing happened in a conference room on the hotel's 2nd floor. Nothing dramatic, as promised. A folding table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard that still had someone else's presentation on it in dry erase marker. Rutherford was there, and the staff sergeant, whose name was Farida Okonkwo, and who had, Madison had quietly confirmed by 8 a.m., a reputation in certain circles as one of the most meticulous investigators currently in a military uniform. There was also a civilian. She hadn't expected the civilian. He was 40-something, in a suit that cost more than Madison's monthly rent, with the kind of careful face that people develop when their job involves saying important things in rooms full of people who don't want to hear them. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, counsel to the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Oversight. "Miss Reed," he said, "or do you prefer—" "Madison is fine." He nodded, opened a folder. The folder was thick. "I'm going to give you the short version first," he said, "and then we'll go through the details. The short version is this. In the spring of 7 years ago, your unit was deployed to an area designated classified under a joint operational framework that, we now have reason to believe, contained significant misrepresentations both to Congress and to the personnel on the ground." He paused. "The mission parameters your team was given were not accurate. The threat assessment was not accurate. The extraction timeline was not accurate. And the people responsible for generating those inaccuracies have, until approximately 8 months ago, faced no formal accountability." The room was very still. The extraction failure, Madison said. Yes. She had a way of sitting that took up very little space. Not hunched, not submissive, just compact, like someone used to working in tight quarters. Watching her, Okonkwo thought, she knew this was coming. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. They knew the route was compromised, Madison said. It wasn't a question. Webb looked at her. What makes you say that? Because of how fast everything happened. You don't get ambushed like that on a route that wasn't already being watched. The timeline? She stopped herself. How much of this is actually new information for you? Some of what you know we have from other sources. Some of it only you can provide. The specific medical decisions you made in the field, the communications you received and from whom, the sequence of orders and counter-orders during the 2-hour period after the first contact. He looked at her steadily. You were the last person with command visibility who was also physically present at every stage of what happened in that valley. Every other witness either didn't survive, wasn't close enough to the decision-making, or is frankly too compromised to be fully credible. Madison was quiet. 11 people, she said finally. The men you brought out. How many didn't come out? Webb glanced at Rutherford. A brief thing, barely a second. 4, Rutherford said. We recovered all of them, eventually, but not… He stopped. Not in time, she said. No. She already knew that number. She had always known that number. She just hadn't said it out loud in 6 years, and hearing it in this room, stated plainly without euphemism or military abstraction, was different from the way she'd carried it. More solid. More specific. Like a stone she'd been holding in a closed fist for so long, she'd forgotten the exact shape of it, and now she could see it. Okay, she said. She opened her hands on the table, looked at them, looked back up. What do you need first? Well, the briefing ran until nearly 6 that evening. Okonkwo took notes in a system that involved a combination of a laptop and a small coded index card system that she'd apparently been using for 15 years and had no intention of modernizing. Webb asked questions with the precision of someone who had read everything and was checking for internal consistency rather than new information. Rutherford mostly listened, occasionally asked for clarification on timelines, and at one point brought everyone sandwiches from the lobby, which were bad but which everyone ate because no one had remembered lunch. Madison answered what she could answer and said clearly when she couldn't. I don't remember the exact frequency. It was one of the emergency channels. I know that much because approximate time? After the second extraction attempt. So maybe 20, 25 minutes after the first contact. She thought about it. Closer to 20. And the order you received at that point was? Fall back to the secondary rally point. Leave the wounded in place. Silence. You didn't comply, Webb said. No. Why? She looked at him like the question was slightly strange. Because there were 11 people who couldn't move on their own. You were told they'd be recovered. I'd been told a lot of things by that point. She said it without heat, just the fact of it. The recovery window they gave me was 4 hours. Closest working field hospital was 6 hours out. Overnight temperatures were going to drop to 18 degrees. Anyone who was hemorrhaging… She stopped. No, the math didn't work. I didn't leave. Webb wrote something, closed the folder. That decision, he said, is one of the central points of the inquiry. Not your decision, the order itself. The people who gave it. She understood. She had understood since the parking lot, probably. Maybe since she'd seen the badge on the ER counter. You didn't build a congressional inquiry around the person who stayed. You built it around the people who told them to go. I'll testify, she said, voluntarily. Webb nodded. We'll schedule the formal deposition for… His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression shifted in a way that was small but not small enough. What? Rutherford said. The hospital. Webb looked up. Callaway Memorial. Their legal team has filed a complaint with the state nursing board, citing the military visit as evidence of undisclosed… He was reading as he spoke. Undisclosed background, potential security concerns, failure to accurately represent professional history on employment documentation. Okonkwo's hand stopped moving on her keyboard. Madison felt something go cold and still in her chest. They're moving to suspend her license, Webb said. She had not raised her voice in 3 years at Callaway Memorial, had not raised it during the medication protocol argument, had not raised it when Patton had publicly second-guessed her in front of 2 residents and a student nurse, had not raised it when her incident reports disappeared into the administrative void. She had learned, had practiced actually, the way you practice a skill you know you'll need, the particular discipline of staying quiet when the louder thing would have felt better. She was quiet now too, but it was a different kind. He can't do that, Okonkwo said. It was the first time she'd spoken in about 40 minutes. A license suspension based on a military visit and a privacy complaint about employment documentation. That's not how the nursing board works. No, Webb agreed, but it buys time. And it puts something on the record that can complicate things, even temporarily. If her license is under review, her credibility as a witness— He stopped himself, looked at Madison. It doesn't affect the deposition. I want to be clear about that. Your testimony isn't contingent on your employment status. I know, Madison said. She was looking at the far wall where the dry erase markers had left a ghost of someone else's flowchart. Supply chain something, numbers and arrows. He knew about the inquiry before I did, she said. Someone told him. The room went still. What makes you— Webb started. The PIP. The performance improvement plan he initiated 2 days ago. She looked back at the table. He's been building documentation on me for months. The incident reports that went nowhere, the float status, the physician complaints. But the timing, initiating formal personnel action 48 hours before 4 military vehicles show up at his hospital, that's not coincidence. She looked at Webb. Someone told him there was a congressional inquiry, and someone told him my name was on it, and he started building a paper trail. Rutherford set down what was left of his sandwich. That's a significant allegation, Webb said. I know, I don't know who, but the timeline doesn't hold up otherwise. Webb looked at Okonkwo. A long look. She was already typing. We'll need to look at Callaway's administrative communications for the past 90 days, Okonkwo said. Legal correspondence, anything touching your personnel file. They'll resist disclosure. They will. She didn't seem particularly troubled by this. That's what court orders are for. Mason. The thing about Gerald Patton that most people at Callaway missed, because most people at Callaway had only ever seen him in environments he controlled, was that he was actually frightened quite easily. He had spent 18 years in hospital administration, building systems that insulated him from challenge, and those systems had worked so consistently that he'd gradually mistaken the insulation for personal invulnerability. He was on his 3rd call with the hospital's legal counsel by 4 that afternoon, in his office with the door locked and the blinds half down, and he was beginning to understand, in the specific way that people understand things they've been refusing to see, that the structure he'd built around himself had a flaw. The nursing board complaint was a protective measure, he said into the phone. The lawyer, her name was Greta Holm, and she was very good, which was why Callaway paid her what they paid her, said, Gerald, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If it comes out that there's any connection between a congressional inquiry and this personnel action, what started as an HR dispute becomes a federal obstruction question. Do you understand what I'm saying? I was acting within my authority as— Gerald, he stopped. Do you understand what I'm saying? A long silence. Yes, he said. Do not make any further moves on her personnel file. Do not communicate with the nursing board until you've talked to me. And if anyone from the Congressional Inquiry Team contacts you directly, anyone, including a very friendly-sounding person who says they just want to clarify something, you call me first, not after, before. A pause. I need to know, is there anything in those communications I should know about before I start seeing it on the other side of a discovery request? Patton looked at his computer screen, at the email thread that went back 11 weeks to an account he'd been very careful about. No, he said. Greta Holm was very good, and she had been doing this long enough to hear the specific texture of that particular pause. She said, Gerald, one more time, softer, which was somehow worse. He closed his email and said he'd call her back. Donna Willard heard about the nursing board complaint from the hospital's HR director at 3:30. She was in the middle of a shift handoff and she stopped in the middle of it, stopped completely, the way you stop when something lands hard enough to require a second. And then she finished the handoff because she was a professional. And then she walked to the break room and stood at the window that looked out on the parking structure and thought about 3 years of watching Madison Reed do everything right and get treated like she was doing it wrong. She'd been witness to some of it, hadn't said anything. That was its own thing to sit with. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. She had Madison's number, the way you have the numbers of coworkers you respect but don't actually call. Present, undialed, theoretical. She looked at it. Then she opened a different contact. One of the senior residents, a man named Dr. Paul Arrieta, who had been in Bay 3 the night Madison stopped the arterial bleed before Voss had even registered the problem. Arrieta had seen it. He hadn't been the one to minimize it. Voss had done that. But he'd been there, and he'd been quiet. And Donna suspected he'd been quiet about it in a way that had been bothering him since. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Did you hear?" she said. "About the nursing board?" His voice was flat. "Yeah, I heard. Are you going to say something?" A long pause. "Donna, because I've been taking a mental inventory for the last 20 minutes of all the times I watched something happen and didn't say anything, and I'm telling you, it's not a comfortable list." Another pause. Different in quality. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "I want you to tell the truth about what you saw. All of it. To whoever's doing the asking." She looked out at the parking structure. "That's all. Just what you actually saw." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding. Then he said, "Do you know how to contact the inquiry team?" She didn't, but she had a feeling she could find out. Madison was back in her apartment by 8 that evening. It was a one-bedroom in a building that had decent bones and a landlord who fixed things when asked, which was about as much as she'd ever wanted from a living situation. She'd packed lightly when she'd left the place she'd been before. The military life compressed you into efficiency, and the years after had kept her that way. She didn't have a lot of things. The things she had were in their places. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and she looked at the email Webb had sent her with the preliminary deposition documents, the date, the location in D.C., the list of topics she'd be expected to address. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She almost always let unknown numbers go. But something made her pick up. Madison Reed. The voice was male, mid-30s, she guessed, with a slight rasp that might have been a healed throat injury or might just have been the way he talked. "Speaking," she said. "This is Travis DeLuca." She set down the glass of water very carefully. "Rutherford said you'd be getting in touch," she said. "He mentioned you remembered I wasn't that heavy." A pause. "I weighed 212 at the time. I've since started a diet." She laughed. It surprised her. Not the laugh itself, but how suddenly it came, and how much it felt like something releasing rather than something starting. "I'm sorry," she said, when she'd stopped. "I shouldn't—" "No, laugh, please. You have no idea how many people I've been telling this story to for 6 years who get this particular look on their face, like—" He broke off. "Like I'm supposed to be broken by it, and maybe some part of me is, I don't know, but mostly I'm here. And that's because of what you did." She didn't have anything to say to that. She knew better than to deflect it. That was its own kind of disrespect. But she also wasn't sure how to simply receive it. That was a skill she'd apparently let atrophy. "I'm going to testify," she said, "in D.C. in 3 weeks." "I know, so am I." A pause. "There are 5 of us so far who have confirmed. A couple of the others—" He stopped. "It's complicated for some of them. Some of them have families, careers that could get tangled in this. I don't blame anyone who says no. What's your situation? 2 kids? A business that's doing okay but not great. A wife who is somehow still putting up with me." He said it with that rueful flatness that indicates genuine gratitude for something a person knows they don't fully deserve. "I decided the complicated version is better than the quiet version. For me, anyway." "Okay," she said. Okay, he said. Then, are you doing all right? Rutherford mentioned there's some HR thing happening with your hospital. It's being managed. That sounds like a Madison Reed answer. You knew me for 14 hours total, give or take, in a valley with a lot of people shooting at us. He paused. That's an efficient way to get to know someone. She looked at the deposition documents on her screen, the date, the location, the list of topics. Travis, she said, the inquiry, what they're building. Do you know how serious it actually is? Not the version they tell us to manage expectations. The real version. A short silence. The serious version, he said, is that 2 of the people who generated those mission parameters are currently in advisory positions to active deployments. And one of them has a very close relationship with 2 members of the committee that's supposed to be investigating. Another pause. The inquiry team has been trying to build the evidentiary record clean enough that it can't be buried by that relationship. Which is why your testimony matters more than they've probably told you. She absorbed that. How do you know all this? I've been doing this for 2 years, he said. I have sources. A beat. Also, one of the inquiry team investigators used to be in my unit. People talk. The kitchen was quiet. She could hear the building's heating system running, and somewhere a floor above her, someone moving around. The ordinary textures of a building at night. If they bury it, she said. If the committee connection is enough to kill the inquiry, then we go public, Travis said. That's the backup. Webb knows it. We're not the only option. A pause. But you're the most credible one. You were the last person standing in that valley who can speak to what the orders were, where they came from, and what the situation actually was on the ground. That's irreplaceable. She looked at her hands. I just want to go back to work, she said. It came out more honestly than she'd intended. I like nursing. I'm good at it, and I like it, and I want to go back to doing it without someone building a paper trail under me. I know. That's all. I know, Madison. I really do. He sounded like he meant it. Do this one thing first, and then, I don't know. I hope it gets to be that simple on the other side. She didn't know either, but she said goodnight, and she closed the laptop, and she stood at her kitchen window for a while looking at the lights of Denton Falls, the city that had been just enough distance from everything that she'd been able to disappear into it, and thought about the fact that the distance had apparently not been as total as she'd believed. Somewhere across town, Gerald Patton had the blinds down and the door locked. Somewhere on the hotel's second floor, Okonkwo was still typing. And somewhere in a filing system that had been very carefully maintained, there was an email thread going back 11 weeks that Patton had looked at and then looked away from, and that Greta Holm had heard in the texture of the pause that followed her question. Madison didn't know about the email thread yet, but by 7 the next morning, she would. Because at 6:52 a.m., someone who had been watching Gerald Patton's correspondence for reasons unrelated to Madison Reed, someone in the hospital's IT infrastructure who had, 8 months ago, been quietly asked to flag certain categories of communication as part of a security audit that Patton himself had authorized without reading closely enough, forwarded 17 emails to an address registered to the Congressional Inquiry Team. And 3 of those emails contained Madison's name. And one of them contained a name she recognized, a name that belonged to someone who, according to every official record, had had no contact with her or with anything related to her military service since the day she'd filed her medical hardship request and walked away. She would see it in the morning. For now, she stood at the window. The lights of the city didn't know anything about any of it. They just stayed on, indifferent and steady, the way cities do when the things happening inside them haven't found the surface yet. The email arrived on her phone at 6:52 a.m., forwarded from Webb's inquiry address with a single line of text above the attachment. You need to see this before our call at 9. She was already awake. She'd been awake since 5, the way she always was after high-stress shifts. Body still running on threat detection mode, scanning for the next thing before the last thing had finished resolving. She was on her second cup of bad instant coffee, still in yesterday's clothes because she'd fallen asleep on the couch without meaning to, and she opened the email sitting in the gray early light of her kitchen with no particular expectation of what she'd find. She read it once. Fast, the way you read something when you're not sure if you're reading it correctly. Then she read it again, slower. The email thread was 17 messages. The oldest dated 11 weeks ago, the most recent 4 days before Rutherford had shown up in her ER. The correspondent on the other end was listed under a corporate email address, a consulting firm she didn't recognize, registered in Delaware, which meant nothing and everything. But the content of the messages, the specific language, the details about her unit designation and her service record and the inquiry itself, none of that came from public sources. None of that came from a hospital administrator doing casual research on a nurse he was building a PIP against. Somewhere in the third email down, she found the name. Colonel Warren Haas. She set the phone face down on the table and sat with that for approximately 30 seconds. Haas had been the senior operations officer on the mission. He was the one who had generated the threat assessment. He was the one who had issued the extraction order, the one she'd ignored, the one that told her to leave 11 men in a valley at 18 degrees with a 4-hour recovery window and a field hospital 6 hours out. She had not seen or spoken to him since the day she'd filed her hardship paperwork, and he'd signed off on it without meeting her eyes. He was currently, according to the last briefing document Webb had sent her, serving as a defense policy consultant to 2 sitting members of the committee overseeing the inquiry into his own conduct. And 11 weeks ago, someone connected to him had made contact with Gerald Patton. She picked the phone back up, called Webb. He answered before the first ring finished. "You saw it. How did you get this?" "Hospital IT security audit. Patton authorized it 8 months ago without reading what he was authorizing. The flagging system was ours, put in place as a precaution when we identified Callaway as your employer." A pause. "We didn't expect it to produce this. You were monitoring the hospital's communications. A specific category of communications, under a legal framework that..." "Webb." "Yes," he said. "We were." She stood up, moved to the window. The city was waking up. She could see the first commuter traffic on the street below, the coffee shop on the corner with its lights on, a woman walking a dog that appeared to be mostly fur. "He knew I was going to be called," she said. "Haas knew, and he found a way to get to someone in my direct professional chain. It appears so. Which means the inquiry has a leak." Another pause, longer. "We believe it's contained to the committee level, not the inquiry team itself. But yes, someone with access to the witness list communicated that information to a party with interest in discrediting or destabilizing the witnesses on it. And Patton's license complaint against me is now being reviewed as potential witness tampering. Yes." She turned that over. Witness tampering was federal. It changed the shape of everything. Not just what Patton had done, but what Haas had potentially directed, and who had facilitated the connection between them, and what that meant for the committee members who were currently supposed to be providing oversight on an inquiry that apparently had a hole in it. "This makes my testimony more complicated," she said. "It makes it more important," Webb corrected. "I know that's not the same thing, but it's what I've got." Massa. She was in Webb's hotel conference room by 8:30, an hour before the scheduled call. Okonkwo was already there, laptop open, 3 index cards lined up beside it. Rutherford was standing at the window with coffee that was also bad, but which he seemed to have stopped noticing. Webb walked them through it systematically. The email thread. The consulting firm, which had been traced overnight to a network of shell entities that connected, after 4 steps, to a lobbying group with documented financial ties to 2 of Haas's current clients. The timing of Patton's personnel actions against Madison overlaid against the dates of the emails. The nursing board complaint filed 31 hours after the most recent message in the thread. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Patton didn't know what he was involved in," Okonkwo said. "Not fully. The emails read like he understood he was protecting himself from a nuisance employee with a complicated background. I don't think he understood the federal dimension." "Does that matter?" Madison said. "For him? Criminally? Maybe. For you? Practically? No." Okonkwo looked at her. "The nursing board complaint still has your license in a review process. That doesn't pause because Patton turns out to be a pawn." "How long does the review take?" "Standard process, 90 days. But there's an expedited path if we can demonstrate the complaint was filed in bad faith as part of an obstruction pattern." Webb looked at her. We're pursuing that, today, if possible. If possible, she said. The board moves at its own pace. She had been a nurse for 7 years, 3 of those years at Callaway. Before that, 2 years at a trauma center in another state, under a different name. Not legally different, just a middle name she'd used for a period when the distance had felt necessary. Before that, the military. The whole architecture of her professional life had been built on maintaining a license, because the license was the one thing that was unambiguously hers, the credential that existed independent of rank or institutional approval, or the opinion of men like Patton who had never once questioned whether their judgment was actually worth what they assumed it was. I need that license, she said. I need it to not be in review when I walk into a deposition room in D.C., because if it is, the first thing any defense counsel is going to do is characterize everything I say as the testimony of someone with a professional grievance and a compromised credential. I know, Webb said. So fix it. We're working. Today, she said. You said today, if possible. Make it possible. Webb looked at her for a second. Then he made a call. The nursing board's legal counsel was a cautious woman named Patricia Seo, who had spent 12 years navigating the space between regulatory process and political pressure, and had developed a particular sensitivity to situations where those two things had been deliberately confused. She listened to Webb's summary for 9 minutes without interrupting. Then she asked 3 very specific questions about the documentary evidence. Then she said she'd need to consult with the board chair. She called back in 40 minutes. The complaint had been placed in administrative hold, pending a full review of the circumstances of its filing. It wasn't a dismissal. Seo was careful about that, because process mattered to her in a way that wasn't just bureaucratic caution, but genuine professional conviction. But it meant Madison's license was no longer in active review status. It meant practically that the 90-day clock had stopped. Rutherford, who had been standing in the same position at the window for the entirety of both calls, said, "Good." Madison said nothing. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully recognized as tension until it was gone. It didn't feel like a victory. Too much was still unresolved, but it felt like the floor had stopped moving, which was something. Then Okonkwo's laptop chimed. Everyone looked at her. Her face didn't change. Okonkwo had the quality of someone who had trained the involuntary reactions out of herself, but she turned the laptop to face the room, and what was on the screen was a news alert. Local Denton Falls media. The headline had been up for 6 minutes. Callaway Memorial Hospital, under federal investigation. Sources. Webb closed his eyes briefly, opened them. Someone leaked. From our side or theirs, Rutherford said. I don't know yet. He was already on his phone. This moves everything up. If this is public, Haas knows we have the emails, Madison said. The room went still. She said it again, more slowly. If this is in the press, Haas knows the investigation has connected to Callaway. He'll know about the email thread within hours, if he doesn't already. Whatever he was planning to do to slow this down, she stopped. He's going to accelerate it. Yes, Warren Haas was not a man who panicked. He had been in operational environments where panic was the thing that got people killed. And he had learned early that the value of staying cold in the moment of crisis was not that it made you feel better. It didn't. But that it gave you the 3 seconds of clear cognition that separated reactive mistakes from calculated responses. He read the news alert on his phone at 9:14 a.m., sitting in his car in the parking garage of a building in a city 200 miles from Denton Falls. He read it twice. Made 2 calls. The first call lasted 4 minutes. The second lasted 45 seconds. Then he sat in the parking garage for a while, in the specific silence of a man recalculating. He had been careful. He had been careful in ways that most people wouldn't have thought to be careful, because most people didn't understand how these things worked, how an investigation built its record, where the vulnerabilities were, which witnesses mattered, and which ones could be neutralized before they became problems. He had understood Madison Reed was going to be a problem from the moment her name appeared on the preliminary witness list. She was the only person who had been in that valley with full situational awareness and no competing institutional loyalty to the decisions that had been made above her. Everyone else had angles. She didn't. The Patton strategy had been elegant in its simplicity, put her professional credibility in question before she could formalize her testimony. A license complaint, even a temporary one, created doubt. Doubt was useful, but the emails were not supposed to exist in the way they apparently existed. The person who had brokered the connection to Patton had been told explicitly, that the communication channel needed to be clean. He opened his contacts, scrolled to a number that wasn't labeled. The call went to voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. Sat for another moment. Then he made a third call, this one to a man who had been his lawyer for 15 years and who had, over those 15 years, seen enough of what Haas was capable of that he picked up with a certain careful neutrality that had become the baseline of their professional relationship. "I need you to prepare for a discovery request," Haas said. A pause. "What kind of timeline?" "Aggressive. Days, not weeks." Another pause. "Longer." "Warren, tell me there's nothing in your written communications that—" "I need you to prepare for a discovery request," Haas said again. The lawyer understood. He'd understood before he asked. At 10:40 that morning, Madison's phone rang with a number she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of reviewing the deposition documents Webb had sent, trying to organize 7 years of buried memory into something coherent enough to be useful testimony, and interruptions were the last thing she needed. She answered because the area code was one she recognized, a city she'd lived in, briefly, before Denton Falls. "Ms. Reed." The voice was male, older, with the particular flatness of someone trying to sound less urgent than they were. "My name is Raymond Goss. I'm calling on behalf of certain individuals who have been following the developments of the past 48 hours, with some concern." She said nothing. "We believe there may be a path toward resolution that avoids the need for formal testimony for everyone involved. Compensation could be discussed. Documentation of record could be—" "Are you a lawyer?" she said. "I represent several—" "Are you a lawyer? Yes or no?" A pause. "I'm an intermediary." "An intermediary for whom?" Another pause. "The wrong kind." She said, "Don't call this number again," and hung up. She sat for 3 seconds, then she called Webb. "Someone just tried to offer me a settlement to not testify," she said. The sound on Webb's end was a chair moving, fast. "What number did they call from?" She read it to him. A pause while he wrote it down, then, "Madison, I need you to understand something. If they're approaching witnesses directly, that's a significant escalation. That's not Patton. That's not a hospital legal team. That's someone who has access to your phone number and believes the inquiry is moving fast enough to require immediate action." "I know what it is," she said. "Are you okay?" She thought about the question, about the fair answer to it. "I'm going to need to talk to Travis DeLuca," she said. "And whoever else from the 11 is confirmed to testify. If they're calling me, they're calling all of us." She heard him exhale. "I'll set up a group call tonight." Tonight might be too late. She stood up, moved to her window again. She'd done a lot of thinking at that window in the past 36 hours. "Webb, how many people on the committee have access to the witness list?" 7. Committee members and their senior staff. "And you've narrowed the leak to committee level?" "That's our current assessment, yes." "Then one of those 7 people, or someone connected to them, just tried to bribe a federal witness." She let that sit. "That's not someone running scared. That's someone who believes they still have enough control to manage this." "Which means they don't know yet how much we have," Webb said slowly. "Right. So when they find out—" His phone chimed on the other end. She could hear it. Then a silence that had a different quality than the silences before. "Webb." "Hold on." His voice had changed. The careful steadiness of it had shifted into something she couldn't quite read. "Madison, I need to put you on hold for approximately 60 seconds. "What happened?" 60 seconds, he said. She waited. 40 seconds. 50. The window showed the same street, the same coffee shop, the same ordinary texture of a city that had no idea what was happening inside one of its hotel conference rooms. Webb came back. "Travis DeLuca was in a car accident," he said, 20 minutes ago. "His wife says he's conscious, but he's at Mercy General in—" "Was it an accident?" she said. The pause was 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in those 4 seconds, everything that had felt like a complicated legal and institutional problem reorganized itself into something with different stakes entirely. "We don't know yet," Webb said. She was in Rutherford's SUV inside of 8 minutes. She hadn't packed anything, hadn't changed clothes, hadn't done anything except put on her jacket, lock her apartment, and text Webb, "I'm going to Mercy General. Don't try to stop me." He hadn't tried. He'd sent back the address and the name of the attending physician, which meant he'd already pulled the hospital records somehow, which she didn't think too hard about because right now, the how didn't matter. Rutherford drove. Okonkwo was in the passenger seat making calls in a low, steady voice that had the quality of someone managing multiple parallel problems simultaneously. The city moved past the windows in the specific blur of morning traffic that doesn't care about anything happening inside the cars moving through it. "What do we know?" Madison said. Okonkwo didn't turn around. Two-vehicle collision. Travis was driving his own car eastbound on Route 9, approximately 7 miles from his house. The other vehicle, a gray sedan, plates registered to a rental company, ran a red light at the intersection and hit the driver's side. A pause. The rental was paid for with a prepaid card. The driver left the scene on foot. The SUV hit a pothole. No one commented on it. "Witnesses?" Madison said. "2. Both say the gray car was already moving through the intersection before the light changed, not running a yellow, running a red that had been red for several seconds." Okonkwo finally looked back. "Local police have the scene. Webb has already contacted the FBI field office." FBI? Potential federal witness intimidation. They don't need much to open a parallel inquiry at this point. Her voice was even, informational. But something underneath it was not even at all. "Travis has a fractured clavicle, 2 broken ribs, and a concussion. His wife was not in the car. His kids were at school." Madison absorbed that last part specifically. His kids were at school. The accident had happened at 10:20 in the morning on a route Travis would take to get from his house to anywhere. Someone had known his schedule, his route, his car. Someone had constructed this with enough lead time to rent a vehicle, position it, and execute it within hours of the news alert going public. That wasn't reactive. That was prepared. "Haas had this ready," she said. Not a question. Rutherford's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. "He had contingencies," she said. "The patent strategy was the soft version. This was the hard version, and he moved to it the moment he knew the emails were exposed." She looked out the window. "Which means there are probably contingencies for the other witnesses, too. For me." "You're with us," Rutherford said. First thing he'd said in 20 minutes. "You stay with us until this is resolved." She didn't argue. She was not naive enough to argue. Mercy General was a larger hospital than Callaway. 4 floors, a level 1 trauma designation, the kind of place that had the resources Callaway always claimed it was about to acquire. Travis DeLuca was in a room on the 3rd floor, curtain half drawn, an IV running, his wife sitting in the chair beside him with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been frightened very recently and was still coming down from it. His name was Travis, and he looked exactly like someone who had been hit broadside by a car that morning. Left arm in a stabilizing brace, a cut above his eye that had been closed with 3 steri strips, the yellow-gray color of someone whose body was redirecting all available resources to managing internal shock. But he was awake. His eyes were clear enough. And when Madison came through the door, he looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. Like, "Of course you're here. You would be." "You look worse than I expected," she said. "You look exactly like I expected," he said. His voice was rough. "Rutherford called it. Said you'd show up in person. How's your pain?" "Managed. They've got me on something." He shifted slightly and regretted it. "My ribs are... yeah. Don't move like that." She came to the side of the bed, not the way a visitor comes, the way a nurse comes, assessing automatically, clocking the IV rate, checking the color of his fingernails, reading the monitor without making it obvious. "Clavicle fracture is clean. They said, no surgery." He watched her. "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" The nurse thing, where you're actually checking me while pretending you're just standing there. She stepped back slightly. Your pupils are even. That's good. His wife, her name was Renata, and she had the face of someone who had been holding it together for 2 hours by pure force of will, looked at Madison and said, "Was it intentional?" Madison looked at her. She'd been a nurse long enough to know that the people in the chairs beside the beds were always asking a real question beneath the surface question, and Renata's real question was, is my husband in danger? Is my family in danger? And is anyone going to tell me the truth about that? We don't know for certain yet, Madison said, but we're treating it as if it was. Renata nodded, once tightly, like she'd expected that answer and had been steeling herself for it. The FBI is getting involved, Madison said. There will be people here, protective detail, probably, within the next few hours. You shouldn't go home yet. Is there somewhere you can take your kids? My sister's, Renata said immediately. She's 40 minutes north. Do that today. Don't wait. Madison looked at Travis. When you're stable enough to be moved, the inquiry team is going to want to transfer you somewhere with better security. That's going to be Webb's call, but I wanted you to hear it from a person instead of a lawyer. Travis looked at her for a moment, something working behind his eyes. They really came at us, he said. Yeah. Which means we have something they can't afford. Yeah. He almost smiled. It cost him, physically, the ribs. But he almost did it. Good, he said. Good. Then we use it. Webb was on a call with the FBI field office when Madison got back to the hotel. Okonkwo met her in the corridor outside the conference room with the index cards in her hand and an expression that said something new had developed. Haas retained outside counsel this morning, Okonkwo said. A firm out of D.C., Kellerman, and Voss. Big enough to signal he's serious, specialized enough in national security law to signal he knows exactly what the inquiry is building. She glanced at the index cards. He's also submitted a voluntary statement to the committee. Preemptive. What does it say? We don't have the full text yet. What we have, she checked a card. He characterizes the mission as conducted within operational parameters that were appropriate given the intelligence available at the time. He acknowledges that outcomes were not as intended. He frames your refusal to follow the extraction order as a unilateral decision made without full situational awareness. She looked up. He's positioning you as the person who created the chaos rather than the person who managed it. Madison stood with that for a second. She had known this was coming, not in detail, but in shape. This was the version of events that was useful to him, the version where the subordinate who ignored orders was the problem, not the orders themselves. It was a coherent narrative if you didn't look closely at the math, and lawyers were very good at preventing juries and committees from looking closely at math. The medical records from the field hospital, she said, the 11 men, their intake documentation, their injury classifications, their treatment timelines. Do we have those? We have some. Several are still classified. We need them declassified. The injury severity on those men proves the 4-hour recovery window was never viable. If any of them had hemorrhagic injuries, hypothermia risk, penetrating trauma, that's medical evidence that overrides the operational narrative. She thought about it. I can walk through it clinically, in deposition, what their injuries were, what the survival math looked like without immediate intervention, what would have happened if I'd pulled back. Okonkwo was writing. That's good, Okonkwo said. That's very good. A clinical analysis from the person who performed the field treatment, corroborated by hospital intake records. It reframes the whole testimony. It's not me saying I made the right call. It's the physiology saying it. Webb came out of the conference room. He looked like someone who had aged slightly in the past 2 hours. FBI has formally opened an investigation into the incident involving Travis DeLuca. Parallel to our inquiry, not subordinate to it. He paused. They've also, and this is new, flagged 2 phone calls made from Warren Haas's personal cell this morning. One to the unlabeled contact we've been tracking. One to a number belonging to a staff member in the office of Representative Dale Cormack. The name landed in the room. Cormack was one of the 7 people with access to the witness list. He was also, as of 6 months ago, a co-sponsor of a defense appropriations amendment that routed significant funding to a program managed by one of Haas's consulting clients. "That's the leak," Madison said. "Almost certainly. We're not there yet legally, but—" Webb rubbed his face. "The FBI moving this fast is unusual. They're treating this as a connected series rather than isolated incidents, which means they see a pattern we haven't formally articulated yet. What do they need from us? Coordination. And your deposition moved up. They want it in 4 days." 4 days. She'd had 3 weeks in her head. 3 weeks to prepare, to organize, to reconstruct 7 years of carefully buried memory into something coherent enough to withstand the scrutiny of defense counsel who would be very, very good and very, very motivated. 4 days, she said. "I know. I need the field medical records. I need them declassified, or I need someone with authority to walk me through what's in them on the record." She looked at Rutherford, who had come in behind Webb. "Can you do that?" "I can make calls," Rutherford said. "Make them now." When Gerald Patton had spent the morning in his office with the door locked, and Greta Holm on the phone approximately every 40 minutes. The rhythm of the day had a particular quality, each call slightly more alarming than the last, the ground shifting incrementally, the thing he'd understood as a manageable HR situation revealing itself, layer by layer, as something he had no framework for. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Holm called and said, "Gerald, the FBI has requested your voluntary cooperation in an investigation. I need you to understand, voluntary means you still have choices. But those choices have a window, and that window is closing." He stopped. "I didn't know what I was involved in." "I believe you," she said. And she did mostly. Patton was many things. A bully, a political animal, a man who had built his career on institutional protection of himself, but he was not sophisticated enough to have understood the federal dimensions of what he'd been recruited into. But "I didn't know" is not a legal defense by itself. It's a starting point. What we need to do with it depends entirely on what's in those communications and how cooperatively you engage with the people asking about them. He thought about the emails. He thought about the 3 that contained Madison's name. He thought about the one that contained very specific information about the congressional inquiry that he had, at the time, assumed came from some kind of general professional network. He had not asked where it came from. He had, in retrospect, been quite careful not to ask. "If I cooperate," he said. "Full cooperation, documented, early, and complete, is the only version of this that gives you any chance of professional survival. And even then," she stopped herself. "Let's focus on one thing at a time." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The board. My position? Gerald." Her voice was flat. Not unkind, but flat. "Your position is not the priority right now." He sat in his office with the blinds half down and the door locked, and for the first time in 18 years of hospital administration, he had no mechanism left to make the problem smaller. At 2:30 that afternoon, Rutherford got the field medical records declassified. Not all of them. 3 remained sealed under an active security review, but 8 of the 11 intake records from the field hospital came through, and Madison sat with them at the conference table for 90 minutes, while Okonkwo documented and Webb prepared the deposition framework. And what the record showed was, clinically, exactly what she'd known it would show. 3 of the 11 men had presented with hemorrhagic injuries classified as severe. GSW to the torso, femoral involvement, blood loss substantial enough that field hospital intake notes described 2 of them as critical on arrival. The field hospital was, by verified logistics records, 5 hours and 40 minutes from the valley by the fastest available route. The projected overnight low temperature for the area on that date was 16 degrees Fahrenheit, not 18. She'd been misremembering slightly, and the actual number was worse. Hypothermia onset in a wounded, immobile patient in 16-degree exposure without insulation began at approximately 90 minutes. Survivable, potentially, for someone healthy. Accelerated catastrophically by blood loss. The 4-hour recovery window Haas had given her had, by the medical math, been a death sentence for at minimum 4 of the 11 men. Possibly more. She wrote up the clinical analysis in 2 hours. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was methodology and numbers and references to established trauma protocols, and it was the most effective testimony she could offer because it removed the question of her judgment entirely and replaced it with physiology, which did not negotiate. When she finished, she handed it to Webb. He read it in silence. Then he read it again. "This is—" He stopped. "It's what the records show," she said. "This is going to be difficult for their defense to counter without expert witnesses who are willing to contradict established trauma medicine." "They can try," she said. "The numbers don't move." Rutherford was reading over Webb's shoulder. He'd been in that valley. Not in the same position. He'd been at the rally point, receiving the situation reports, managing the extraction failure from a distance of 2 kilometers. He had lived with his own version of that night for 7 years. But seeing it laid out in clinical language, in the specific grammar of medicine and temperature and blood loss and time, was different from the version he'd been carrying. He set the papers down, said nothing for a moment, then, "They knew. When they gave you that order, they knew the math didn't work. Or they didn't do the math," Madison said, "which is its own answer." The press got the story at 4:47 that afternoon. Not the full story, not yet, but enough. A reporter at a D.C. political outlet published a piece citing 2 anonymous sources within the congressional inquiry, describing a federal investigation into potential witness intimidation connected to a House subcommittee inquiry. The piece named Warren Haas by name. It described in general terms the nature of the military operation under review. It did not name Madison, but it described a key witness, a former military medical specialist currently employed as a civilian nurse in Denton Falls. Her phone started ringing within minutes, numbers she didn't recognize. She turned it face down and did not answer. Webb was on 3 calls simultaneously. Okonkwo was tracking the online spread of the article, watching which outlets picked it up and in what framing. Rutherford was on the phone with someone at the Department of Defense whose name he didn't share. The news cycle moved the way news cycles moved when a story had been building in a closed system and finally found an exit. Fast, and then faster. By 6 that evening, Haas's voluntary statement to the committee had leaked. Someone had photographed it and sent the image to 2 reporters, and both had published it, which meant both Haas's version of events and the implicit admission that he'd needed to submit a version of events were now publicly available simultaneously. His lawyer issued a statement describing the leak as a politically motivated attack on a decorated officer's reputation. The statement used the phrase unilateral decision 3 times in reference to Madison, which told her exactly what the defense strategy was going to be. She read it on Okonkwo's laptop, read it twice. "He's going to try to make the whole inquiry about me," she said. "He's going to try," Webb said. "It won't work, but he's going to try. I need to be very prepared. You have 4 days. 3, actually. Travel day." She looked at the clinical analysis she'd prepared, still on the table. "Get me the remaining 3 field records, whatever level of clearance it takes. I need to see all 11. 2 of the 3 remaining are going to be difficult. The third," Webb hesitated. "The third one is Haas's own operational log from that night. It exists. We know it exists. Getting access to it in the next 72 hours is—" "Try," she said. He tried. Patton's cooperation with the FBI began formally at 5 p.m. the same day in a conference room at the Federal Building with Greta Holm beside him and a recording device on the table. He answered every question he was asked. He answered them fully, in a way that suggested he had decided somewhere in the previous 8 hours that the only remaining version of this he could survive was the version where he told the truth completely enough that the people across the table from him understood he was not the architect. He explained how the contact had been made, the name of the intermediary, the man who had called himself Raymond Goss, who was, it turned out, not a lawyer and not actually named Raymond Goss. He explained what he'd been told about Madison, that she was a liability, that her background contained elements that would embarrass the hospital, that acting on the existing performance issues was simply good administration that happened to align with certain other interests. He explained that he had understood he was being used for something but had chosen not to understand it specifically. The FBI agent across the table from him was a woman in her mid-40s who had the particular expression of someone who had heard this specific variety of self-justification many times and had no remaining emotional reaction to it. You understood you were being directed to take adverse action against an employee who was going to be a federal witness, she said. Not a question. Patton looked at Holm. Holm said nothing. She'd told him, answer the question accurately. Yes, Patton said. And you complied. Yes. The agent wrote something. The recording device's light stayed steady red. By 8 p.m., the intermediary, not Raymond Goss, but a man named Victor Strand, who had a history of working adjacent to several consulting firms connected to defense lobbying, had been identified, located, and contacted by FBI agents in a city 3 states away. Strand, who had made the miscalculation of using his real phone for the call to Madison, did not have a lawyer present when the agents knocked. He had one within the hour, but the hour had already happened. Madison learned this from Webb at 9 p.m. She was sitting in her hotel room, but they'd moved her to the hotel. Rutherford had been quiet but firm about it, with the clinical analysis on the desk and a room service meal she'd eaten mechanically without tasting. She felt not triumphant because this wasn't triumph. It was a machine moving through its stages. She was part of the machine. Strand talked, she said. Enough. He's positioning himself as a conduit, not a decision maker, which is probably accurate. The question is how far up the chain his information goes and whether any of it is documented. Webb paused. There's something else. The FBI found something in Strand's communications, a payment record, a transfer, 2 days ago, to an account we're still tracing. 2 days ago, she said, the day after we arrived in Denton Falls. She thought about that. They moved money the day after Rutherford found me, before the news leak, before the nursing board complaint. She leaned back in the chair. They were paying for the contingency in advance. That's what it looks like. Which means someone told them Rutherford had made contact, someone who knew the inquiry team had found me before the hospital situation made it obvious, she paused. Not Patton. He found out when Rutherford walked into his hospital. The leak was at the inquiry level. Cormac's office, Webb said. You need to be certain before you move on that. I know, He stopped. Something on his end. A voice, not directed at the phone, and then Webb came back. Madison, the FBI has Haas's operational log. She sat up. Not through us. They executed a search warrant on his home office this afternoon, separate from anything we requested. They found physical copies, printed, not digital, of operational documentation from the period in question. A pause. Including a memorandum dated the night of the extraction failure, addressed to 2 senior officers above him in the chain of command. What does it say? We don't have the full text. What the agent told me. He stopped and she could hear him choosing words carefully. The memo describes the extraction order and frames it as a solution to a command problem, not an operational necessity, a solution to a problem. Another pause. The problem, as characterized in the memo, was that the mission parameters had been misrepresented to congressional oversight, and a successful extraction of all wounded personnel would have required documentation that would have revealed the misrepresentation. She heard it. She let it land. He ordered them left, she said, because getting them out would have proved he'd lied to Congress. That's what the memo appears to document, yes. She sat in the hotel room with that knowledge, which was not new knowledge. She had understood this at some level, in the part of her that understood things without having language for them, since she had been standing in that valley deciding whether to follow an order that didn't make sense, and felt it shift from the category of things she had suspected into the category of things that existed on paper. Who else had access to this memo? She said. The 2 officers it was addressed to, both retired. We're trying to locate them tonight. And Haas, does he know you have it? His lawyer will know by morning. She looked at the window. Night had gone full dark over the city, and the lights outside were the same as they'd always been. Indifferent, steady, city lights doing what city lights do. He's going to do something, she said. His lawyer will advise him to... Haas doesn't take advice, she said. He took advice when the advice aligned with what he'd already decided. When it doesn't... She stopped. He built contingencies. Multiple layers. Patton was one. Strand was one. The accident was one. If those are all unraveling, he has something else. We have people on him. You have the FBI watching a man who spent 30 years making decisions in environments where being watched was the normal condition. She looked at the clinical analysis on the desk. He's already made the next move. We just don't know what it is yet. The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Ordinary sound, the kind that doesn't mean anything. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. She looked at it. 4 words. Check your personnel file. She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she called Okonkwo. My personnel file at Callaway, she said. I need you to pull it right now, whatever access you have. It's 9:30 at night. Okonkwo. A pause. Then the sound of keys. 40 seconds. Then, Madison. Okonkwo's voice had lost its evenness. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. There's a notation added to your file today. Administrative flag. Cross-reference to your original employment application. What does it say? It cites a discrepancy in your professional history documentation. A pause. It specifically flags that the name you used at your previous employer, the trauma center position before Callaway, doesn't match your legal name on your original military service record. She felt something cold move through her. The middle name, she said. The application lists your middle name as your surname. The military record has your full legal name. Okonkwo's voice was very careful. On its own, this is an administrative inconsistency, explainable. But whoever added this flag also attached a separate document, a longer pause. It's a copy of your military service record, Madison, the full record, including the classified unit designation, the operational deployment, and the reason for your hardship separation. Another pause. This was added to your personnel file at Callaway Memorial at 3:17 this afternoon, after Patton's cooperation with the FBI began. After Patton cooperated, which meant Patton hadn't added it. Who has access to Callaway's HR system besides Patton, she said. In theory, HR administrators, System 1T, and anyone with administrator credentials. And who has her military service record? The full classified version? Okonkwo didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The full classified service record was not a document that circulated freely. It required clearance to access and a specific reason to pull it, and the number of people who could have obtained it and deposited it into a civilian hospital's HR system was not large. It was in fact small enough that it pointed in one direction. And the direction it pointed was not toward Warren Haas. The direction it pointed was toward Representative Dale Cormack's office. Not Haas, not Strand, not any of the peripheral figures who had been useful and expendable. The classified service record, the full version with the unit designation and the operational deployment and the hardship separation, existed in a database that required congressional security clearance to access. Haas had consulting relationships with committee members, but he didn't have the clearance himself. Not anymore. Retirement had ended that. Cormack's senior staff director did. Madison held that understanding in the hotel room for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got up, put on her shoes, and walked down the corridor to the conference room where Okonkwo was still at her laptop. Cormack's staff director, Madison said. Name. Okonkwo didn't look up. Brian Torrance, 12 years in the office. Former Army intelligence, left the service in... She stopped typing. Left the service 8 years ago, 1 year before your deployment. Did he know Haas? I'm checking. Fingers moving. Joint Operational Planning Committee, 7 years ago. Haas was the senior officer. Torrance was an analyst attached to the committee. She looked up. They worked together for 14 months. The shape of it was complete now. Haas had known Torrance from the service. Torrance had gone into politics, had ended up in a position with clearance and committee access. When the inquiry started moving toward Haas, Cormack, who had financial reasons to protect Haas's clients, had given Torrance the room to use that access for something it was never supposed to be used for. And Torrance had pulled Madison's classified record and dropped it into Callaway's HR system as a final maneuver, a contingency that was supposed to activate only if everything else failed. It was designed to reopen her license question, to create the appearance of deliberate identity fraud, to give defense counsel in the deposition enough ammunition to spend the first 2 hours attacking her credibility instead of engaging with her testimony. It was, she thought, almost elegant, in the specific way that desperate things sometimes were. She called Webb. He answered in one ring. She could hear from his voice that he hadn't slept. "I know," he said. "Okonkwo already sent me the file access log. We're looking at torrents." He pulled it under his staff credentials. "It'll be documented." "It is. The access timestamp is in the system. We have it." A pause. "Madison, I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear it before you hear it from someone else." He stopped. Cormac submitted his resignation from the subcommittee 40 minutes ago. He's citing personal health reasons. She was quiet. "His lawyer contacted the FBI simultaneously," Webb said. "He's cooperating, full cooperation. He's characterizing everything as torrents acting independently, which is..." A pause. "Which is probably not entirely accurate, but Cormac has information about Haas's relationship with his office that goes back 4 years, and the FBI wants that more than they want to spend 6 months proving what Cormac authorized versus what he tolerated. And Torrance? Arrested at his home at 9:15 tonight, federal charges. Unauthorized access to classified records, witness tampering, conspiracy." A pause. "He didn't say anything to the arresting agents, not a word, that's a lawyer's advice. He had representation in place before they knocked." He'd been ready. He'd known the moment Patton started cooperating that the line was going to trace back. He'd prepared for it, and then he'd made the move with the personnel file anyway, because by that point it wasn't strategy anymore. It was damage. Pure damage. The kind of thing you do when you've accepted that you're going down and you want to take what you can with you. "The deposition," she said. "Still in 3 days, in D.C. Nothing about tonight changes that." Webb's voice was careful. "If anything, the evidentiary record is stronger now. What you provide in deposition will land in a context where the surrounding corroboration is already documented." "And Haas?" "His lawyer contacted the committee's general counsel at 10 this afternoon. They're negotiating the terms of a formal interview." A pause. "Not a deposition, an interview, which means he still thinks he has room to manage it." "Does he?" A longer pause. "Less than he thinks," Webb said. She slept that night. Actually slept. Not the shallow maintenance sleep of someone keeping one ear toward the door, but the heavy, dark kind that comes when the body finally accepts that there is nothing more it can do before morning. She woke at 5:30 with the specific clarity of someone whose nervous system had decided, somewhere in the night, that the survival phase was transitioning into something else. She showered, put on the same clothes she'd been cycling through for 3 days because she hadn't been home since this started, and she stood at the bathroom mirror for a moment looking at herself in the fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly like a problem. She was 31 years old. She had spent the last 3 years of her life in a hospital where she had been consistently underestimated, routinely exploited, and ultimately targeted by a process that was designed to silence her. Before that, she had spent 14 months in a classified unit performing medicine under conditions that most people who used the word difficult in professional contexts had no framework for. And before that, she had been a person who believed in the uncomplicated way you believe things before experience complicates them, that doing the right thing was its own protection. She had learned that it wasn't. She had lived inside that lesson for 6 years. And she had kept doing the right thing anyway, not because she believed it protected her, but because she'd looked at the alternative and found it unlivable. That was not a lesson that came with a reward. It was just a fact about who she was, and she'd made a certain peace with it somewhere along the way. The peace was imperfect and sometimes thin, but it held. She dried her face, went to get coffee. The 3 days before the deposition were not quiet. Nothing about the situation was quiet now that it had found the surface. The news coverage accelerated in the way that stories accelerate when the institutional architecture around them starts publicly failing. Cormac's resignation from the subcommittee was confirmed by his office with a statement so brief it confirmed nothing and implied everything. A political reporter published a timeline of Haas's consulting relationships and their intersections with Cormac's committee work that was thorough enough to suggest someone inside one of those offices had decided to get ahead of the story by contributing to it. Callaway Memorial's board of directors issued a statement saying they were cooperating with all relevant investigations, which was the institutional equivalent of throwing Patton out a window while maintaining that the window had always been open. Patton was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The announcement went out in an internal email that the nursing staff received at 7 a.m. on a Thursday. Donna Willard read it in the break room before her shift and then sat with it for a while, thinking about 3 years of watching things happen that she hadn't moved on and what that made her. She called Madison that morning. Madison was in the hotel conference room working through deposition prep with Webb, and she almost didn't pick up, but Donna's name was in her contacts and she did. "I heard about the leave," Madison said. "I wanted to—" Donna stopped, started again. "I wanted to say that I saw more than I reported. Over the past 3 years, I documented some of it, privately. If it's useful to whoever's investigating, I want to make it available." Madison was quiet for a moment. "Call Greta Holm, his lawyer. She'll direct you to the right place." "Okay." A pause. "Madison, I'm sorry I didn't—" "I know," Madison said, not dismissively, just, "I know, the way you say it when you actually mean it, and you're not trying to make the other person feel better, just telling them the truth. It's documented now. That's what matters." After she hung up, Webb looked at her across the table. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm a lot of things," she said. "Angry's in there. But Donna's not the reason any of this happened." She picked up the deposition notes. "Can we go back to the timeline, the sequence of orders on the night of the extraction?" They went back to the timeline. She flew to D.C. on a Tuesday morning on a flight that was delayed 40 minutes for mechanical reasons, and then delayed another 20 because the gate agent couldn't locate 3 passengers who had apparently gone to the wrong terminal. She sat in the plastic airport chair with her deposition notes on her phone, reading them for what was probably the 12th time, and thought about the fact that the version of her life that had existed 10 days ago, the double shifts, the ignored incident reports, the managed distance relationship with a hospital that had never once made her feel like she belonged, was no longer the current version, and she wasn't sure yet what the current version was going to be. Travis DeLuca was in D.C. already. He'd been transported 2 days ago, stable enough to travel, his ribs taped and his clavicle in a sling. They had dinner the night she arrived, at a restaurant near the hotel that was ordinary and a little loud and exactly right for that reason. Renata was there, and their presence together, 3 people connected by an event that had happened 7 years ago in a valley none of them had wanted to be in, had the specific texture of things that are simultaneously too big and too ordinary to fully acknowledge. Travis ate carefully because his ribs made leaning forward painful. Renata talked about her sister's house, where the kids had been for a week now. Madison asked about Travis's business, which was a small electrical contracting operation that he'd built from nothing after leaving the service. And he talked about it the way people talk about things they've made with their own hands, with the mixture of pride and anxiety that comes from having put something real into the world. "You going to be okay tomorrow?" he said when they were almost done. "Define okay," she said. "Functional, present, saying the things you need to say." "Yes." "Do you want—" He stopped. "I was going to offer to run through it with you, but I think you've probably run through it enough." 12 times, she said. "Then you're done running through it." He picked up his water. "Just remember, they're going to try to make you defend the decision, to justify it, and you can't let them keep you in that frame, because in that frame you're just a subordinate who disobeyed an order." "I know. The frame is the medicine, the math, what the bodies needed versus what the order assumed." He looked at her. "That's not a judgment call. That's a fact. You keep it a fact." She looked at him across the restaurant table, at the man she had dragged across 40 meters of open ground while things were trying to kill both of them, who had built a life, who had 2 kids and a business and a wife who was still putting up with him, and who had spent 2 years pushing toward this moment because he had decided the complicated version was better than the quiet version. "You know," she said, "you were not that heavy." He laughed, and then grabbed his ribs, and then laughed again despite that, and Renata looked at both of them like they were slightly insane, and also, somehow, exactly what she'd needed to see. The deposition room was smaller than she'd expected. Conference table, recording equipment, a window that looked out on a gray February sky over D.C. rooftops. Webb was there. The inquiry's lead attorney, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who had the focused energy of someone who had been working toward this specific moment for 8 months, was there. 2 additional staff members. A court reporter. Haas's attorney had been invited to send representation. The chair where that representation would have sat was empty. Haas had declined, through counsel, to participate in this deposition. His formal interview with the committee was still being negotiated, and his lawyers had decided that any additional evidentiary record created before those negotiations concluded was not in their client's interest. The empty chair said more than anything his lawyer could have said. Pruitt opened the session, stated the date, the nature of the proceeding, the names present, asked Madison to confirm her identity, her professional history, her connection to the matter under inquiry. Madison answered every question the same way she'd answered everything for the past 3 years, clearly, without ornamentation, and without giving anything away that hadn't been asked for. Then Pruitt said, "Ms. Reed, take us to the night of the extraction failure. Start where you think is the right place to start." Madison started at the mission briefing. The threat assessment they'd been given, which she walked through from memory with the kind of precision that comes from having reconstructed a thing so many times it has become structural. The parameters, the route, the timeline they'd been handed, and the ways in which that timeline had, within the first 40 minutes of the operation, stopped matching what was actually happening on the ground. She talked for a long time. She talked about the communication she'd received ordering the withdrawal. She talked about the 11 men, not by name, but by injury classification, what each one had presented with, what the survival math looked like without immediate intervention, what her assessment had been in the specific conditions of that specific night. She referenced the field hospital intake records. She referenced established trauma protocols for hemorrhagic injury in cold exposure environments. She kept it clinical because clinical was the language that didn't negotiate, and she was not in that room to be moving or compelling or sympathetic. She was in that room to be a fact. Pruitt let her talk, occasionally asked a question that opened a new thread. At one point said, "When you received the order to withdraw, what was your assessment of the source of that order?" "It came through the chain of command. I didn't question the source in the moment. I questioned the logic." "What specifically did you question?" "The recovery window. 4 hours was not a viable survival window for the patients I was with. I did the math in my head in approximately 30 seconds. The math was not complicated." She paused. "I've since seen documentation suggesting that the people who issued that order understood the math and issued it anyway. I didn't know that at the time. In the moment, I just knew the math didn't work, and I wasn't going to walk away from 11 men because someone's timeline was optimistic." The room was very quiet. "And now that you know what the documentation suggests," Pruitt said. Madison looked at her. "Now I know it wasn't a mistake," she said. "It was a decision." The deposition ran 4 hours and 17 minutes. She was not shaking when she came out, which she hadn't been certain about going in. She was tired in the specific way of having said everything there was to say and having nothing left to manage. Travis was in the corridor, in a chair outside the room, his arm in its sling, waiting. He'd given his own deposition the previous afternoon. She sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. "Empty," she said. "In a way that might become okay later." He nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. She could see that he did. "What do you do now?" he said. "I go back to Denton Falls," she said. "I go back to work." "At Callaway?" "No." She said it with a certainty that surprised her slightly. Not the certainty itself, which had been building for days, but how complete it felt when she said it out loud. "Shira Moss, the overnight attending at Callaway. She's been texting me every 2 days since this started. Checking in, no agenda." She looked at the ceiling. "She mentioned that Mercy General, the hospital they took Travis to, is looking for experienced ER nurses for their trauma team." Travis turned his head carefully, the way he turned everything carefully since the accident. "Mercy General is a good hospital." "I know. Level 1 trauma, better staffing ratios than Callaway." "I know." "You'd be—" He stopped himself. "You don't need me to tell you you'd be good at it." "No," she agreed. He was quiet for a second, then, "The men who couldn't come home. You know we carry them. All of us who made it out." She looked at her hands. "I know," she said. "This doesn't fix that. Nothing fixes that." He said it plainly, without drama, the way you say things that are simply true and don't require softening. "But this matters. What you did in that room today, it goes in the record. It can't be buried now." A pause. "They died because someone decided their lives were acceptable collateral for a lie. At least now that's a documented fact instead of a classified secret." She didn't say anything. "That's not enough," he said. "I know it's not enough, but it's something." It was something. She let it be something. Warren Haas gave his formal statement to the committee 3 weeks later, after his lawyers had spent those 3 weeks negotiating terms that ultimately did not protect him from very much. The statement was 11 pages. It acknowledged operational failures. It did not use the word deliberate. It characterized the extraction order as a judgment call made under significant informational uncertainty. The committee released their findings 6 weeks after that. The report was 340 pages. Madison read it in her apartment over 2 evenings, with coffee that was better than hospital vending machine coffee because she had bought an actual coffee maker, which was a small and real improvement to her daily existence. The report found that the mission parameters had been materially misrepresented to congressional oversight. It found that the extraction order had been issued with knowledge that the recovery timeline was not viable. It found that the deaths of 4 service members in the Valley were directly attributable to that order, and that the order had been issued in part to prevent documentation that would have revealed the original misrepresentation. It found that subsequent actions taken to intimidate witnesses, including but not limited to the personnel actions against Madison Reed at Callaway Memorial Hospital, the suspicious vehicle incident involving Travis DeLuca, and the unauthorized access to and distribution of classified personnel records, constituted a coordinated obstruction effort involving multiple actors at multiple levels. Warren Haas was referred for criminal prosecution on 4 counts, including conspiracy and obstruction of a congressional inquiry. His consulting contracts were terminated before the report was even published. Clients have a particular sensitivity to these things and don't generally wait for the legal process to conclude before protecting themselves. Brian Torrance pled guilty to 2 federal charges. He received 30 months. Victor Strand cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced charge. He received 18 months of supervised release and a fine. Gerald Patton was terminated from Callaway Memorial with no severance, a finding of professional misconduct in his personnel file, and a civil complaint filed by the hospital's board seeking recovery of damages related to his actions. He retained a lawyer. The process was going to take a long time and was not going to resolve in a way that left him comfortable. Callaway Memorial itself issued a formal apology, a real one, not a PR statement, to Madison Reed, submitted in writing to the state nursing board, and entered into the public record. The board reviewed it, reviewed the full record of the nursing board complaint and its circumstances, and closed the file with a notation that the original complaint had been filed in bad faith and that Madison Reed's license record remained clear. The apology was 3 paragraphs. She read it once, didn't read it again. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't the thing that mattered most to her. The thing that happened that mattered most to her was quieter than any of it. It was a Thursday afternoon in April. She was 3 weeks into her position on Mercy General's trauma team, which was harder than Callaway in the ways that good work is harder than managed down mediocrity, and she was coming off a 12-hour shift that had included a pediatric trauma that had resolved well, and an elderly patient with a complicated septic picture that had not resolved well, and 2 routine cases that had been neither dramatic nor simple. She was tired in the honest way of having done real work. She was in the locker room changing out of her scrubs when Dr. Shira Moss appeared in the doorway. Moss had left Callaway 2 weeks after Madison, had, it turned out, been looking for an exit for longer than that, and the events of February had clarified something she'd been deciding. She was now in Mercy General's ED attending rotation, and the 2 of them had developed the kind of working relationship that is built on mutual professional respect and the shared experience of having been in a situation that was larger than either of them. "You have a visitor," Moss said. "Main entrance. He said his name was Marcus. Said you'd know who he was." Marcus Webb. She'd spoken to him twice since D.C., once when the report was released, once when the Haas referral was confirmed. Both times brief, functional. He didn't seem like the type to drop by without a reason. She went to the main entrance. He was standing near the information desk in the same expensive suit, with a folder under his arm and the same careful face. Beside him was a man she hadn't expected. Rutherford, in uniform, with something in his hand. She stopped a few feet away, looked at them both. "This isn't the official version," Rutherford said. "The official version has a venue and a date and logistics that we're still working out. But there's a thing," he stopped. For a man who communicated in facts and didn't ornamentation, this was unusual. "There's a thing that should have happened 7 years ago, and it didn't happen because the situation was classified, and then because you disappeared, and then because I should have looked harder and faster than I did." He paused. "So this is me doing the part I can do today, instead of waiting for the logistics." He held out the folder. She took it, opened it. It was a formal nomination document, dated the year she'd left the service. Her name on it, the unit designation, a description of actions in the valley, precise, clinical, the language of military documentation, followed by a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Medal. The nomination had been submitted by 2 of the wounded soldiers within 3 months of the operation. It had been classified, filed, and functionally buried for 7 years, because the people responsible for processing it had also been responsible for what had created the need for it. The committee's report had, among its findings, noted the existence of suppressed commendation records for personnel involved in the Valley operation. The military had begun a formal review process, but review processes moved on their own timeline, and Rutherford had apparently decided that some things shouldn't wait for the timeline. She looked at the document, at her name on it, at the description of what she'd done, written in the flat formal language of official record, which somehow made it more real rather than less. The specific vocabulary of an institution acknowledging, on paper, a thing that had happened. "The formal ceremony will be when it's been processed through review," Rutherford said. "Weeks, maybe 2 months. But I wanted you to see it now. The nomination was real. It was always real. It just got buried with everything else." She looked up from the document. She was not, in general, a person who cried at things. She had trained that response out of herself in environments where it was a liability, and it had never fully come back. But something in her face did something, a shift, barely perceptible, that Rutherford recognized because he'd been in hard places and seen what people looked like when something long held finally settled. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words. They were the right 2 words. Webb cleared his throat. "There's also..." He produced something from his jacket pocket, passed it to her. "Travis wanted you to have this before the official event. He said, and I'm quoting, she should have it where she can see it instead of in a pile of official envelopes." It was a photograph, 8 by 10, printed properly, not just snapped on a phone. It was the 11 men, all of them, gathered in the same place, which must have required significant coordination because they were scattered across different states and different lives. They were standing together in someone's backyard, in ordinary civilian clothes, in varying states of age and change. Some had kids visible at the edges. One had a dog. Travis was in the front, his arm still in the sling from the accident. He was not smiling in a posed way. He was smiling in the specific way of someone who had pushed for 2 years toward something and finally gotten there. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, but that was clearly a group effort. Different pens, different pressures, some neat and some barely legible. "You didn't leave. We didn't forget." 11 signatures. She held the photograph. The main entrance of Mercy General was not a dramatic location. Fluorescent lights, the smell of industrial cleaner, someone at the information desk explaining visiting hours to a man who hadn't heard the first explanation. The ordinary machinery of a place where people came when things had gone wrong and needed someone to help them through it. She had spent 7 years in these places. She had spent 7 years being the person who showed up for double shifts and swallowed incident reports and dragged herself through institutional indifference and kept doing the work because the work mattered, regardless of whether the institution deserved her best version of it. She had spent 7 years very carefully not looking at the photograph she was now holding, not counting the 11, not letting herself know with certainty whether the math had worked. The math had worked. All of them. She folded the photograph carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, beside the worn combat medic badge she'd been carrying for 2 months. "When's the official ceremony?" she said. 8 weeks approximately, Rutherford said. DC most likely. The 11 have all confirmed they want to be there. Travis too? Travis especially. She nodded, looked at the 2 men across from her, at the folder still in her other hand. "I have a 12-hour shift tomorrow," she said, "and I have to be back here in 6 hours for a briefing on a new trauma protocol." Rutherford almost smiled. "That sounds about right." "Yeah." She tucked the folder under her arm. "It does." She walked back toward the locker room. Moss was in the corridor waiting with the specific tact of someone who had clocked what was happening and given it the space it needed. She fell into step beside Madison without asking anything. "You okay?" Moss said finally. Madison thought about what Rutherford had said in the parking lot of Callaway Memorial 2 months ago, standing in the cold with 2 bad cups of coffee, the city just beginning to gray toward dawn. She thought about the deposition room, the empty chair, the 4 hours and 17 minutes of saying everything she'd carried and finally putting it somewhere it could be used. She thought about Travis in the restaurant, eating carefully, talking about his business, laughing despite his ribs. She thought about the photograph in her pocket. 11 people in someone's backyard in ordinary clothes, not performing anything, just existing in the specific way of people who had decided that existing was enough of a statement. She wasn't fixed. She knew that. The 4 who hadn't come out of the valley were still 4. The 3 years at Callaway were still 3 years. The 7 years of managed distance from the things she'd survived were still 7 years of her life that had been shaped by someone else's decision to bury the truth. Those things didn't resolve. They became part of the architecture. You carried them differently as time went on. Not lighter, just more familiar, more integrated into the structure of who you were. And you kept working because the work was real and the people who needed it were real, and that had always been enough to get up for. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." They walked back into the hospital together, into the lights and the noise, and the particular organized urgency of a place that never stopped needing people who knew what they were doing. Someone at the nurses' station called Moss's name. A monitor alarmed somewhere down the hall. The ordinary forward motion of a day that still had hours left in it. Madison Reed put one hand briefly on the pocket where the photograph was, feeling the edge of it through the fabric. Then she went to work. There is a version of this story where the institution protects itself, and the person it failed disappears quietly into a life they've learned to make smaller, where the emails stay buried and the inquiry stalls and the man with the memo in his home office keeps his consulting contracts, and the woman who dragged 11 people out of a valley on a 16-degree night keeps swallowing incident reports and eating lunch alone and telling herself that doing the work is enough, even when the work is the only thing they've left her with. That version happens more often than this one. What made this version different was not that the right people suddenly developed consciences, or that institutions recognized their own failures and corrected them, or that the truth had some inherent property that guaranteed its own emergence. None of those things are reliably true. What made this version different was a woman who had decided, somewhere in the specific darkness of a valley, where everything had gone wrong and the order said to leave, that she was not going to make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's calculation, who had carried that decision for 7 years through every form of institutional pressure designed to convince her she was wrong, who had kept doing the work not because anyone was watching, not because it would eventually be recognized, but because the work was real and the people who needed it were real. And she was not the kind of person who walked away from real things. That is a hard way to be. It costs something, consistently, that doesn't always get paid back. But it is also the only way that any of the 11 signatures on the back of that photograph exist in the world. And on a Thursday evening in April, in the corridor of a Level 1 trauma center in Denton Falls, that fact was not lost on the woman who put her hand briefly on her jacket pocket and then walked back into the work that she had always, in the most honest part of herself, known was hers to do.